All right. Hi, everyone. Um, this is Naomi Klein, for those of you who don't know me. Um, I want to welcome all of my students from my Corporate Self course, Extraction, Enclosures, and Escape Routes. And it's mostly just our seminar here, but we have a few Rutgers colleagues listening in who are excited about our guest speaker today. So without further ado, because her time is so precious, and we have her for an hour, I want to introduce Zephyr Teachout. Zephyr, thank you so much for being here with us. Zephyr is an academic, an activist, a former political candidate in the state of New York. She is currently an associate professor of law at Fordham University and has written dozens of law review articles and essays, as well as the books Corruption in America, from Benjamin Franklin's Snuff Box to Citizens United, and most recently, an incredible book called Break 'em Up, very relevant, recovering our freedom from big ag, big tech, and big money. And today we're going to be focusing on the big tech part of that equation. I don't want to read more of her bio just because I want to make the most of our time together. But I do want to mention a paper that she co-wrote with Sabeel Rahman, titled "From Private Bads to Public Goods: Adapting Public Utility Regulation for Informational Infrastructure," which is, to me, one of the most enlightening frameworks for understanding what to do about the pressing question of our polluted information ecology. And it explores the possibilities of regulating big tech companies as public utilities. Zephyr, it is amazing to have you with us. Thank you for making the time before you teach in less than an hour from now. I want to start by asking you to summarize the thesis of that paper.
Yeah.
Where it fits in with your other work around breaking up big tech, but really laying out the case for regulating companies like Google and Facebook as public utilities, as essential infrastructure that's vital to our democracy.
Yeah. So thank you for having me here. It's such a treat. I'm such a fan. When I was writing my book, I would go back to Naomi's books and be like, how did she craft this? Besides being an amazing thinker, an amazing writer, and somebody who certainly influenced me in really significant ways. And I'm about to go teach corporate law, speaking of corporate selves, which is always...
It's very subversive. I love to think of you teaching
totally.
Corporate law.
No. So we have a information infrastructure now, which is so toxic and dangerous and disturbing. And we have debates that are also often feel like just the wrong debates. And it's debates that many of you might have been in, like yesterday, when Facebook announced that it was taking down vaccine conspiracy theories. In the wake of that news, you will find people debating whether or not Facebook should take down this piece of news or that piece of news, whether or not Facebook should follow the WHO, whether or not Facebook should be, would have, using this rubric, taken down or left up the early advice against masks. And while you may have a perspective on those debates, you may also, as I certainly do, have a nagging sense like these are the wrong debates to be having. There's something really dark about engaging in discussion about what Mark Zuckerberg should and shouldn't decide, because the reasons for his authority, he doesn't have any political legitimacy. The idea that we have kind of naturalized and accepted Zuckerberg and Google and Apple as the arbiters of our discourse, who we should then beg in petitions to honor our particular desires, is really is sort of an awful and subservient and dangerous position. Another example that's happening right now is fears that Facebook might ban the word Zionist. And Facebook's official response to that fear, because it's at least under review whether it would ban the word Zionist as anti-Semitic. Facebook's response to that charge is, well, we're still under review, and we won't ban it except when it is dehumanizing. And just that interaction where we have gotten to a point where we accept Zuckerberg and Google and Tim Cook of Apple as being in a position where they can decide what is dehumanizing and what is not is really disturbing. And it's not like debating what the New York Times should or shouldn't post, because these companies are infrastructure. And that's sorry, I took a minute to get there, but
yeah. I mean, this is what's striking reading your paper, Zephyr, is like just the scale of it, like how much, like we know that the public infrastructure of the internet has been swallowed by private platforms, but you're talking about a much vaster form of swallowing of the town square, the street. So speak to the scale.
Okay, sorry.
Why is it infrastructure?
So it's infrastructure because, I mean, you can go to dictionary definitions, that which is essential for commerce and social life. It's not that there's like a simple definition of infrastructure, but these are platforms upon which communication happens. You can't be a small business and avoid these big platforms. If you're an activist or want to reach a large platform, you're going to use these platforms. You don't find politicians avoiding Facebook or Google, and it would be irresponsible if they did, because they need to reach people and let people know what they're thinking about. Thought leaders, you're going to use all newspapers, news organizations, they rely on these. These aren't, it isn't a choice. And so they have replaced collectively, as thank you for getting me back here, sidewalks, the town square, the post office, where we mail things to each other, the telephone. So it's like, if you have then your telephone company, your sidewalks, your post office, all owned by the same three people. Mm-hmm. And then those three people are not, like communications infrastructure of most of American history, neutral. These are communications infrastructure that are actively making decisions about what the content is. So if you remember the network neutrality fight, it's about, how should we treat cable companies? Are they, and the conclusion is, no, these are infrastructural, and they shouldn't be able to pick and choose between different forms of content. They shouldn't be able to say, we don't want to hear, just like your telephone company shouldn't say, you can't talk about abortion on the phone. You shouldn't, mm-hmm. or it costs you more to talk about abortion on the phone. The network neutrality idea is that ISPs can't say it costs you more to communicate certain kinds of information. But we're not at the ISP level. We are now at Google, Facebook, our core social media, search, video, and app companies. And the problems with this is, one, what I started with is that it leads to totally unaccountable decision-making about what is speech. And it could be made for reasons you like, reasons you don't like. It can certainly be made for, and is made for commercial reasons, but also whim. Zuckerberg and Sandberg got together and made a decision a few years ago to change the prioritization of video on Facebook, for instance. And they thought it would make them more money. They ended up changing their mind on it. Mm-hmm. That algorithmic change, choosing to prioritize video content, transformed newsrooms around the country. Sort of these, a small group of people by whim can change what is prioritized, which then tells the Cleveland Plain Dealer, we got to fire our print journalists and hire video journalists. So there's incredible concentration of whimsical power. It's also profit maximizing power. That's one problem, radical concentration power. But then the second problem is the business model. And the business model that's used is something we have never had for communications infrastructure, which is the targeted ads business model. The targeted ads business model has 5 different major democratic downsides. I say it more sort of fiercely in the paper, but like they major problems for a democracy. And again, I think it's useful to imagine this business model, forget Facebook for a second and think about it for your public library.
Yeah, I like that example. Like, what would it look like if your public library ran on the same incentive structure as Facebook?
Yeah, and
What
so
would it
they'd
look
be
like?
like, okay, so what we need to do is gather as much information as possible as we can on everybody who comes in the door, and then sell to Exxon, Nike, and pick your other company. Tell me some of the companies you've been beating up on. And I don't know,
cool opportunity.
Bed Bath and Beyond. Bed Bath and Beyond. You're going to sell that, and also your local businesses. You're going to sell access to that information. So, so that Naomi will get targeted ads based on what that the public library knows about her. Well, the first thing you would see is that there would be maximal surveillance, because the targeted ads business model, they don't even know how to use the information. There's a lot of reason to think like it's not like they're perfectly efficient, by the way. They're powerful. That doesn't mean they're geniuses. But maximal information about how our keystrokes work. There would be, throughout the public library, sensors everywhere. Well, think about how that shapes then how a person operates in a space. And we've moved quickly into living in a surveillance communications infrastructure, but Naomi and I certainly grew up outside of that. And there is a different anxiety around speech and thought and curiosity when you know everything is tracked. So it shapes the person by that awareness that everything is being surveyed. Mm-hmm. The second thing you'd see is maximal conflict. So instead of your public librarian saying, shh, they'd say, fight, 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 fight. Because as humans, we're pretty wired to seek out watching conflict. And it raises our attention and interest. So you would see content that would lead to conflict being prioritized. White nationalism, conspiracy theory, suspicion, a high degrees of sensationalism in the public library. And of course, both of these things are things that you see with YouTube and Facebook, is maximal surveillance and a maximal degree of conflict-driven content. So people often think about, even the language of platform makes us think about them as flat, as if they're sort of a default of neutrality. But they're not. They're constantly picking and choosing what information is in front of you. So it feels like, oh, I'm just going on to see what my friends are doing. It's like, no, you're going on to see what Facebook has decided will keep you on the site the longest.
Right, and they're changing. I mean, this is something that you're like, when I think about writing my first book using Google search, right? It was a completely different experience. Like I would get much more neutral search results than I do now, which are trying to like prod me and steer me in all kinds of different directions. But it happens gradually. Like nobody ever announces, we're completely changing the business model here, right? So and I think that we've had that experience on all of these platforms, right? Where it starts off as one thing and then it changes over time. And we kind of are still sort of thinking about it as the thing it was before. But
our model in our head. And then just really quickly,
come back to the business case, right?
Yeah. So the other things with the business models, it treats us all differently, which is really bad for democracy. You know, so you're getting different information than I am, and I'm sure I missed something. But what was the term that you're?
Well, what I wanted to just underline is you're talking about the business model being the issue.
Yes.
And Shoshana Zuboff, who we're reading in the class, talks about the business model being surveillance capitalism. I've seen you use the term ad tech to really emphasize that these are not, we talk about them as information companies, but you're saying actually, talk about that term and why you think it's useful.
Yeah, it would be so interesting to be in conversation with Shoshana, because I think there's a lot of areas where we agree, and I think there's some areas where we really disagree. And I think, but like these are sort of
tell us.
Yeah, I know. But one of my goals here is I think that tech makes us feel like we have no power in this context, like that it is so wholly new, and that we don't have any mechanisms for solving it. And I'm not a utopian, and that I don't think we can solve it perfectly, but I actually think it's very useful to see the analogies between this and the telegraph industry of the 1880s and other forms of privately owned companies that have taken on monopoly power and used that in destructive ways that have then been regulated in a way that they can serve the public good, in part because it gives us some power over it. And I do fear that with tech, that techno-utopians and techno-dystopians share an inevitability, a sense that that the tech is doing the work, as opposed to the core sense that, and this is an optimism on my part, that we actually have an enormous amount of power over the way in which these tools can operate. So I'm always trying to de-technify tech, make it seem less like something that is unique to tech, and more like, okay, once we understand these are ad companies that are using this particular business model, like, why are we allowing these ad companies to decide what is dehumanizing content, what is a good health information, and what we read every day? And so this leads to the last step, which is, if we see these historical analogies, then we say, oh my gosh, this isn't that complicated. We keep talking about, like, we're going to regulate Facebook in this way or regulate in that way. Why don't we just say we're going to ban the business model? Like, that's what we've done for utilities in the past. Water, for instance, public utility, has enormous amounts of transparency in terms of how the business operates. Privately owned, but publicly governed, sometimes publicly owned, totally publicly owned. Huge price restrictions. You can't just price gouge on water. I'm not saying that public utility systems have always worked, but we have a whole set of laws that have been used for 200 years to say, okay, if you're infrastructural, you just don't get to be profit maximizing and set your own prices and use whatever business model you want. And to me, the quickest way to get out of these pathologies is, one, break them up. And I think actually both are important, so that we don't have such centralized power. And two, say you're a utility. You can't pick and choose between content. Yeah. And
so what does it mean though to say, okay, you can stay private?
Yes.
I'm not saying we're gonna, you're essential infrastructure, but you're not necessarily public infrastructure, because we've had private telephone companies, private water companies, private, speech is constitutionally protected, but you've got private broadcasters, and but they are regulated. And your point around complexity, I think, is really important, right? Because going back to why this is such an unregulated sphere, the idea of sort of technological complexity, this is too complicated, you'll never understand it, leave it to us geniuses. That has been a really potent tool in tech, also finance. Like, whenever people tell you it's too complicated for you to understand, like, definitely, like, grab your wallet, right?
Right, exactly. No, it's an incredible rhetorical, it's effective. People are like, I don't understand it. Or right now, what you'll see in a lot of the people that I find myself debating is they'll say, we need a regulator for tech, which is like a unique regulator that just deals with tech. So it's like, let the experts handle these complicated questions of tech. And first of all, that's just invitation for revolving door corruption, because once you have sector specific regulators, the industry spends all its energy making sure its people get in there. But it also takes it out of democratic control. And people are smart enough; they can figure out they don't want poisonous public infrastructure. So you said something really that I just want to pause on for a second, which is, all corporations are public. And this is sort of a key fact that we don't talk about, but I'm sure you've talked about in this class, is that corporations are allowed, businesses are allowed to incorporate because of the state. They're like mini grants of governing power to the corporation. The early corporations, of course, were in fact cities and towns. And so it's not that there are wholly private corporations. If you are corporate, you are a creature of the state. And modern neoliberalism will just deny that up and down, but it's just this is historical fact and it's a technical fact. And then there are degrees of publicness. You can have public ownership so that the state absolutely runs it. You can have, and you can have heavy degrees of public regulation. And I actually think like those are the lines, like let's debate. I think the advantage of having multiple social media companies that are privately owned but heavily regulated is because it's in the speech sphere,
right?
That there's a value in not having the government be making those decisions. But effectively,
but you make rules of the road.
But you make
talk about,
yeah,
right? If you own the local TV and radio station, you can't also own the newspaper,
right?
And one could certainly see how those sorts of principles would apply to where we're getting our news now,
right? Yeah. And the default rule in and I don't mean to be too nostalgic, like we're all trying to create a world we've never had, but the default rule in American communications policy has been decentralization of private communications, decentralization. So you just mentioned you can't cross own, even though there were local monopolistic newspapers, which everybody will bring up when you have this conversation. The owner of the newspaper couldn't also own the radio station, the TV station. So there's both decentralized geographically and decentralized.
And they always challenge it. Corporate power always challenges these restrictions. But I mean, you mentioned that reminding us that corporations are products of the state, are governed by the state. I often feel when I watch you testify, in Congress, that you're just like shaking these politicians, like, you have these laws, like I am just asking you to enforce your own law, and you're like almost educating them about what the state is, what the role is, because they are products of the neoliberal era, and they believe that their job is essentially just to liberate capital and get out of the way. And but it's like this interesting
radical lack of empowerment.
Is it shifting? I mean, you get invited to testify. I see that as a good sign.
No, I would say it's shifting hugely. And the resistance is extraordinary. So it's like this, we are in sort of this epic battle moment where the audacity of companies like Facebook and Amazon, I mean, they are just openly saying, we want to go, you don't want to govern yourselves, we want to govern you. And I actually do want to just talk about this briefly. It's something I've been thinking about. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think that part of the reason people embrace, this is a total speculation, so that are hesitant to embrace a Facebook and YouTube or public utilities and then decentralized media creators is because there's something a little relaxing in, like, they're going to decide these tough questions around speech. The authoritarian control relieves people of some of the responsibilities of saying really hard things about the kinds of speech which they find truly horrific and yet think should be allowed to exist in the public sphere. I don't know. Do you think that's part of it, or do you just think it's a sort of sense of disempowerment? Because most of the time when I talk to people about Facebook, there's just a sense of what can we do, like boycott, and I really, really, really resist the idea of boycotting as the first step, because I think it it like makes us forget that like Chuck Schumer has real power. Chuck Schumer can change the rules for Facebook. Like, let's go to Chuck Schumer before you go to Zuckerberg.
Right. And I think that I think we're in a very difficult situation, because I think people don't trust either Chuck Schumer or Mark Zuckerberg to make these core decisions. Which is why I think that the historical examples that you draw on are useful. And so I just want to back up a little bit, because I'm not sure we've fully unpacked. So you're saying, when you say it's a public utility, you're not saying it's nationalize it. You're also not saying don't nationalize it. Like you're neutral on this question. Like at the end of the paper, you say, there are other questions around what if there should be some municipalizations, because we've seen some cities step in and say, this is essential infrastructure. This is what they've done in Barcelona, and really, and I think we feel this really intensely during COVID, where we need these technologies in order to do pretty much everything, including what we're doing right now. Right? I mean, you published this before COVID, and you talked about everything that's been swallowed up. What about our public schools and our public universities like Rutgers, right? I mean, we're on private tech platforms right now. This isn't going to be going on forever, but I think these technologies are going to stay in our school system in a much more central place than they were before COVID. And so we need to decide, is this a backdoor privatization that's happening? What kind of democratic control are we going to exert? So you're neutral on
and to that point, we are just outsourcing so much of public education to tech companies. And it's been an explicit strategy of tech companies, not just to take over new forms of infrastructure, but to strategize to get into old forms of infrastructure by becoming first, by offering free, quote unquote, services in exchange for schools and cities using them. The free is not free. It's in exchange for extraordinary amounts of data and really a backdoor into control of education, which is a huge passion of mine, but we'll put that aside.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. But for people who aren't familiar with public utility law, what would it mean in practice to say, okay, you are so important to the core functioning of society, to democratic discussion, but also all these other things, right? Education, health now. So what does it mean to say you're a utility?
Yeah, so if you are essential, the traditional rules are rules of access and non-discrimination. So the example that people often use is public utilities, almost all were initially private and then became categorized as public utilities. So trains are probably the easiest to make sense of, that were both racially discriminating and discriminating based on price in the 19th century. So they would decide what car you go into based on race, and decide, and this is sort of notorious, a separate but equal Supreme Court precedent says trains, even if they're public, can discriminate in this racist way. But the non-discrimination principle is you cannot discriminate against those who want to have access, and you can't give them different prices too. And the way that they would use different pricing is that they would say, basically, we are going to charge farmers different prices to carry their goods. And because they had full visibility into the product that was being carried on their lines and they could charge different amounts, they could effectively get the full profit that any farmer was making. It'd be like, oh, this farmer is making $20 extra, so I'm going to take 20 from this one. This farmer's making an extra 5, so I'll take 5 from this one. And they could maximally extract. I know you talk a lot about extraction, but basically extract all the value that the farmers were creating, and also essentially govern them, because farmers would know, like, I have to do whatever this this train company says. they demand that I carry potatoes along with my carrots. I better do that, otherwise I'm going to get kicked off the train. And so the public utility regime, the non-discrimination regime, says, no, you have to give access to everybody and you can't discriminate as between different parties. Still privately owned, and prices are posted. So how much you are going to pay is shared. You don't have to be differentially treated. So that's just one example. But what that means in terms of Facebook, and I just want to be clear, what I'm talking about would be a major change. Like, I don't want to pretend I'm talking small changes here. It would mean content wouldn't be treated differently. So if Roger posts it, I'm just looking at some of the people here. If Roger posts at 1:30 and Nicole posts at 1:35 and Daphne posts at 1:40, I see Roger's post and then Nicole's post and then Daphne's post. Instead of, because Daphne said, like, fuck you, Donald Trump, which is like, all the algorithms are like, it's conflict, lots of debate. We'll put Daphne's post first. So that kind of sequential Facebook is like the Facebook we used to have. And it's totally different. And so there is a cost. Like, it's nice for Facebook to pay attention to you and know that you happen to like, Daphne's like, yes, that's what I would have said. Okay. But it's nice, it's not, there's no, did I freeze up? Are you still
No, you're fine. You're fine. You're not frozen.
It's not that there is zero cost here. As a friend of mine said, on the one hand, you could lose the opportunity to be deeply known and see those special green shoes that you never would have otherwise thought of be advertised to you. On the other hand, you can have a democracy. So but there is a cost. It's not like
one of my favorite tweets I saw, like somebody tweeted last year, like, I miss the days when I could just glance at a pair of shoes, in a store window and move on and not have that pair of shoes follow me around
exactly.
Weeks on end. But no, one of the things I hear a lot from my students is that there are conveniences, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways it's nicer to be advertised for things that you might actually like than things that, are of absolutely no interest to you. But there may actually be ways to include some of the best of algorithms and recommendations, if we are looking at things like how the data is being stored, or do you think we have to just give up on having algorithms recommend for us?
Well, you could, I mean,
maybe not.
I'd prefer to give up on it and just be honest about it. It's like, the Fourth Amendment includes some trade-offs. Like, we don't get to search people who we think are guilty. I think it's worth it. Like, that you bind your hands in some way. But if you are concerned about the informational extraction part, then banning algorithmic decision-making is essential. If what you're most concerned about, and I think to me, it's such a problem. Not just because of the extraction, but like right now about conspiracy theories. We're trying to deal with conspiracy theories in a weird substance way, like this is a conspiracy theory and this isn't a conspiracy theory. And I mean, maybe I'm a little too old school, mid-century First Amendment, but I really don't like government-like institutions making these decisions. And I just don't think it's a serious argument to say that Facebook isn't playing a government-like role. I mean, it's like you'd have to be a radical formalist to say it's not a government.
It's also subjective, I mean, because the issue is the algorithms and the pathways that make it spread so easily, and the incentives for engagement and conflict that make these conspiracies spread. And also, by the way, and this is intimately connected to your Break 'em Up writing, but it's also that this has replaced journalism in a lot of areas, right? So
Yeah.
the only place that people are getting information is some random Facebook group or some free dodgy newspaper that gets put, in their mailboxes, funded by really questionable sources, right? So this is some of the only newsprint people are seeing, or they don't have a local newspaper, they have a local Facebook group. And this is intimately connected to that ad tech technology and the fact that tech companies are hoovering up all the ad dollars. And this is really important. I think, I teach in the School of Communications at Rutgers, and this is related to the job market that young people are going into.
So you get to the last.
Yeah, but I just wanted to just say,
for democracy. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The conspiracy theory thing resonates with me because I am incredibly concerned about the spread of conspiracy theories.
Right.
But when I published the shock doctrine in 2007,
right,
a lot of very serious people, were like, oh my God, the idea that governments would take advantage of a state of shock to push through neoliberal policies, that's a conspiracy theory. I was called a conspiracy theorist by very serious people like Ezra Klein and, Jonathan Chait and all these, and now it's like the most obvious thing in the world. Nobody would deny it. And so it gets used as a political tool. The label conspiracy theory gets used as a political cudgel. And I don't want Mark Zuckerberg deciding what's a conspiracy theory or not. I know how ideological that label can be. I just don't want the incentives for any conspiracy theory, to be in place in our information ecology.
So I think people are like, oh, it's so great that Zuckerberg can do this right now, can quickly shut down these conspiracy theories or Trump. But it's like, well, why don't we just step back 3 steps and say the business model encouraged it. The business model clearly supported Trump. Like Trump is native to this business model. He's all about maximal conflict, right? So it's like step back and say, there's going to be a lot of information out there that is actually awful. But we don't have our sidewalks and our school buses and our telephones incentivizing the worst part of it. And right now, I'd rather have some bad information out there and neutral infrastructure than infrastructure which is designed to maximize toxic information and the ability to swoop in and have private actors censor it. So there is a trade-off between the two, but to me, it's like a no-brainer between those two.
Right. And I think it's really, it's important that you're raising that challenge around, are we just kind of avoiding the conversations about what sort of speech we can tolerate and just letting these private companies make the decisions for us? Because the other thing that's happening is that progressives are sort of abdicating a lot of those debates, and the right is the only one, and the very far right are the only ones talking about free expression and First Amendment, and that's worrying, right?
It's so worrying, and it's being done in bad faith, but it will gain adherence,
Right.
Because if anybody who is an anti-vaxxer, which I do, and they are, and the right is saying, Zuckerberg is taking away your speech rights. It's like, oh, I want to hear more of that. And it's like if the left is not engaging, the problem is like Jim Jordan, he's just lying. He's doing it in bad faith. And so it's bad politics, it's bad policy, but it's also bad politics not to say, no, we actually really believe in a decentralized communication sphere. And we are going to take on Facebook on policy grounds. And I answered your earlier question too unoptimistically. There's a huge move happening right now. Like there's huge sense of opportunity. Joe Biden, not my candidate, doesn't love Facebook. So, and actually this is just speculation, but he doesn't. This is one thing that we are still waiting on some key appointments, but he doesn't have the kind of attraction to the technocratic big tech crowd that a lot of the Obama people did. So, I mean, Obama just got deeply in bed with big tech, and especially Google.
And then if you look at what people did after their time in the Obama administration, there was just, a super highway to Silicon
to
Valley.
Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, in as much as so far there have been a few, but so far it doesn't look like Obama and tech. It was as if you had. I mean, tech was kind of treated as like different in a good way.
No, I always thought it was very funny that, you know, we were reading Shoshana's book, but Shoshana Zuboff's book,
Yeah.
right when it came out, because she sent it to me in galleys. So
Oh wow.
you know,
Yeah.
and so we were reading it actually before it came out, and then it was so interesting to see Obama choose it as his #1 favorite book of 2009.
right.
I'm like, wait a minute, you did this. So, but I thought it was a good sign that when we originally invited you to come speak to us, I invited you and your co-author, Sabeel Rahman, and he's not here because he's working for Biden, which I took as a good sign for the.
Yeah, and he's absolutely fantastic. So it's just
So tell us some good signs.
Okay.
Tell us some warning signs about the new administration. What should we watch for to know whether they're serious about really changing the incentives in tech?
Yeah.
Or ad tech.
So the good signs are, one, last fall, actually over last year, David Cicilline and the House Antitrust subcommittee did this kind of extraordinary thing, which is use his power. Congress just doesn't use its power a lot of the time. It doesn't use its subpoena power. It's like, oh, if we don't have the votes in the Senate, but like use the investigative power, investigate big corporations. And they got over 1 million documents. They got big tech CEOs to come in and testify. They got amazing witnesses. And this is a committee that ranges from, like, you know, heroes of mine like Pramila Jayapal to many more centrist Dems. You know, it's by no means like a uniform committee. And this committee came out with a amazing report, just like shivers through your spine report, that didn't call for modification around the edges, but for massive breakups, horizontal, which is to say Facebook can't own Instagram, kind of a no-brainer. Vertical breakups, like Google search shouldn't own YouTube, also kind of a no-brainer. Google search shouldn't own Google Flights, like competing on its own platform.
Right.
And a call for non-discrimination regimes. And it didn't lay out what that was, but like, that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about public utility regimes, we're talking about non-discrimination. Like, you are so public that you can't pick and choose between different parties. It was an incredible report. And if that gets into law, and basically over the next few years, there's going to be a big fight about whether that gets put into law, or whether something will happen. Klobuchar talks about this so well, and she's actually been really great on media, you know, and talked about the one last thing we haven't talked about, which is they're stealing from journalists. It's like 99% of new digital ad dollars are going to Facebook and Google. And you know where they're not going? They're not going to the hundreds of thousands of journalists. So it's not just that they're promoting toxic information, they're stealing from local journalists who share good local information. And is, as you say, it's just devastating. And they are thieves. In my book, I interview the former executive editor of the Daily News, who's like, these are thieves. They are stealing. They're just like, they're standing in the narrowest path they've created a choke point, and they're like, hand over your money if you're the Rutgers paper, the Daily News.
I mean, emphasis that it's not by coincidence that he's former, because when you are running one of these publications, you know, you can speak out a little bit, but they are so dependent on Facebook to drive traffic to their sites that, you know, we're not really getting honest talk from journalists at the moment.
This out. It's like, okay, so journalists go to the wall for sunshine laws, you know, like, boy, yeah. But your industry is getting killed. Like, why aren't journalists doing blackout days, like demanding change? And I think it's that the people who are inside journalists, when they still have their job, they need access. They're
Oh,
scared.
absolutely. Yeah, they're really scared.
They're,
Yeah.
And the fear in these newsrooms is not healthy. And so they're just like, I want the last piece. I want to be part of the ship before it crumbles. And then there's other institutions, the ones who are speaking out, they've kind of jumped ship on the targeted ad business model. Like, we basically have the elite journalists, elite institutions that can make their money on subscriptions. But there's no more Poughkeepsie. I mean, there is still a Poughkeepsie Journal, but the Poughkeepsie Journal is then gone. So,
right.
So I would like to see.
So the New York Times is doing actually really well. People are subscribing to the New York Times, but it's basically the New York Times and the Washington Post in the States that are doing okay with subscriptions.
And they like doing well with subscriptions, but they also don't want to be in the bad graces of Facebook and Google, because they still want to be high in search results. So one of the darkest things that Facebook has done is it's doing prioritized news and deciding what is good news and what is bad news, and having profit sharing arrangements with some elite news organizations. And then that also keeps them bought in. So even if they're making money through subscription, they're still like bought into the Facebook power structure. It's so dystopian, but the good news is what's happening at the congressional level. In states, there's increasing interest in legislation. Most of that isn't on the media front, though. Honestly, it's more on like other antitrust fronts. But everybody bringing cases, all the 48 states bringing cases against Facebook and Google, that's really important. We can't just sort of sit around and wait for the state AGs to prove their monopolization cases, which I think they'll win. But it tells you that they're lawbreakers. So I've talked about this in abstract terms, but it is important to remember they've also done it through breaking antitrust laws that nobody's been enforcing. So it's like, stop holding them up as shiny, treat them more like tobacco companies. And then, so there's definite energy. There's two real major directions that the policy could go in right now. And I want to talk about where the right's pushing. And where I'm pushing, and actually, I think I actually support both, but there's so much bad faith on the part of the right. It's like talking about when Trump does something right, you're like, but he's not honest about it. Right. And they are pushing to say, why don't we treat Facebook and Google like publishers? Because they're acting like publishers. Right. So they should be liable in the same way that another news organization is. And I think the risk there is, I just don't want them as our meta publishers. Right. Like, so let's say you repeal Section 230 and they are liable in the way that a news organization is.
But how does that help the right? I'm not clear on how that helps the right anyway. Certainly not Donald Trump, who's a libel machine. But
there's so much bad faith. That's what I mean. It's not at all clear that what they are pushing for is something that they themselves would benefit from. And there's been some nice writing about that. That shows the evidence of bad faithness. But the reason they're doing is it's easy to understand. And what I support is a version of that, which is if you promote something, at least you should be liable for it.
Okay. That's interesting.
So you don't get to actively promote libel and then say, or promoting violence and then say, oh, I take no responsibility for it. I just don't.
So there's the publisher box.
Yes.
And then yours is the
railroad box.
Utility.
Yeah.
The railroad. Yeah. Okay.
So
that we can still have publishers, like actual journalistic organizations. Yeah.
And then those actual journalistic organizations, you can say to, like, don't publish this conspiracy theory. And it's like, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's one of the best professors in the country. But at least, like, I don't think it's illegitimate to have those debates. It's just illegitimate to have these debates with like 3 men. Right.
And if you have diversity in the media sphere, then it's okay if some people decide not to publish something.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that no one's going to see it and it's completely shut down. I just want, but I know we're losing you soon, but I just wanted to, we talking about the subscribers. The subscribers are the ones who are doing okay, right? And I've read a lot of sort of mea culpas from the people who built these platforms, and a lot of them say, okay, our foundational error was when we made it free. We made it free,
Right.
and the cost of free was ads, and that's what
Yes.
created ad tech. So the solution is we have to pay for it.
Yep.
Now, my concern is that if this is essential infrastructure, and we already have a massive digital divide, then why don't we just say, hey, like this
Yeah.
is a public good, and we built much of the infrastructure ourselves anyway with tax dollars. Everyone has a right to it. How are you navigating this tension around this is an essential infrastructure, and just getting people to pay for it is the sort of easiest way out, in a sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because we ended up doing the calculations in our paper, and it's like maybe it would be $1 a month, maybe it'd be $20 a month. And that's just assuming we still want to give Facebook the same profits we do now, which I don't. It's like,
right.
just to say you pay for a subscription model. We have a subscription model, for instance, for telephones, which maybe should be free, So I don't think it's a crazy question. I mean, obviously, I don't think it's a crazy question to say, do we think it should be free? It's in the public utility realm. Many things are not free, but the prices are capped.
Right.
And I actually think our phone services cost people way too much, and it's a serious divide issue as well. It's not a.
And we're also entering into this sphere now where people, like, we are paying for so many, or we're being asked to pay for so many different platforms. So
right.
If you look at Facebook and you came up with the $25 amount, that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're paying for all of these different platforms, it definitely adds up.
No, it's a good point, because I think I try to say all of our job is to say what we think the best policy is, and then figure out the politics afterwards. But I suspect that part of the reason I start with the subscription model is that we're so used to thinking of Facebook and Google as speech regulators, that if you say, let's nationalize it, it sounds like we would then be giving it takes a few steps to realize we're not talking about nationalizing the right to control, which I think would be dangerous if you just say Facebook as it currently exists should be then monitored by an agency deciding what posts you see. That sounds totally dystopic, right? And so it's, but if you say Facebook is in the public utility model is free, or Facebook in the public utility model is publicly owned, those are variations. It's not like it's and those all sound like totally reasonable variations to me, if it is not discriminating.
Right.
And then what you do, and people will miss it because we want our shoes. You then say, okay, there's no ads on this platform. Forget targeted ads. Just say this is a no ad platform. And that would then go back to coming full circle to your, the core problem of advertising. And we're on sort of extreme advertising. And the final thing that this business model has done, which is so dark, and that Tristan Harris and Roger McNamee and other designers who have been early involved in Facebook have said, is what we're doing is, it's not just that we're creating a toxic, conflict-ridden, isolated, surveillance maximizing infrastructure. We're creating something that maximizes addictions. It's like a public health disaster. And the depression and isolation and anxiety that comes, like, we have public infrastructure that's an anxiety and depression machine. Like, do you want to get on a bus?
Yeah.
You want to get on a bus and know when you get off, you're going to be more depressed? It's terrible. Like, you want your public infrastructure to at least not depress you.
Well, to have the public good at heart. And I think that, navigating a world that is just using Las Vegas technology to try to entrap you and addict you, and then be kind of told, well, it's your fault. Like, you need to treat this like an addiction and just like go cold turkey instead of, well, actually people have a right, and particularly young people have a right, to navigate the world without it just being a sort of, just a maze of all of these different interests that are just trying to pull you into various rabbit holes that are not in your best interest. And even just saying that is just sort of like, well, that's radical.
And
It's
what's
really not.
happening now, and what will happen as cities are, our cities are incredibly poor, is it's not Facebook staying on Facebook. What is happening, for instance, in New York City, is there are kiosks all around the city that gather information in exchange for us. It's public infrastructure. It's explicitly public infrastructure. It's the place where you can go recharge your phone or get Wi-Fi. And basically the city has said, we want the Facebook model for our public infrastructure. So it's coming to our buses. It's coming to our public schools. It's already in our public schools to some degree. So I think it's like resisting it on Facebook, recognizing the public infrastructure on Facebook and Google as they are, but it's like, it's not stopping there. And this is, Shoshana does an amazing job of showing how it's everywhere. So
yeah, and you mentioned Sidewalk Labs in the Toronto example, which Toronto had, in the end, because of really great organizing, they did defeat Sidewalk Labs. But thinking about coming out of COVID, and all of these cities are going to be broke, are going to be looking for new revenue streams.
I know, I'm so scared.
And yeah.
So it's like,
have
good
this
news,
on our radar.
bad news. Yeah.
And I think Cheyenne mentioned the Nevada bill that would allow big tech to set up their own governments. I'm sure you saw that fly
I
by.
did.
You have a class to teach, Zephyr. This was so fun.
I know. It's I just feel like we're just getting into it. And I see these great questions in the comments. But thank you to your students.
We will take up the questions in our class. So you'll have to settle with my attempt to channel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to see you. And yes.
You too. All right. Have a great day. Bye.